Ladies and gentlemen, we all want closure. We all want to believe that the person who walked away without a fight will one day look back and feel the weight of what they lost. But the truth is, regret doesn't show up when you're still hoping for it. It doesn't arrive when you're still checking your phone, still wondering what you could have done differently. Regret only shows up once you've moved on, when your heart no longer reaches for them, when your energy is no longer available on demand. That's when it hits them, not when they had you, but when they realize they can't anymore, and that, right there, is where this story begins. People often confuse silence with strength. They assume that staying quiet is the more mature route, that walking away without a word shows control, composure, and confidence. But that's a lie we tell ourselves to avoid feeling the discomfort of emotional responsibility. Silence doesn't always mean someone has moved on. It can just as easily mean they weren't equipped to deal with the truth, and rather than own that, they vanish. When someone cares deeply and walks away without saying a thing, no closure, no conversation, no accountability, that's not strength. That's fear. That's emotional avoidance dressed up to look like dignity, because strength would mean sitting in the awkwardness. Strength would mean saying what needs to be said, even if your voice shakes. Strength is vulnerability, not escape. Avoidance, on the other hand, is easy. It's the path of least resistance. You don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to answer tough questions. You don't have to face the impact you had on someone else's heart. You just disappear and hope time covers it all up, and for a while it does. The silence buys them time to convince themselves that disappearing was somehow the cleaner choice, that not dragging things out was somehow more respectful. But it's not respect if it leaves the other person feeling abandoned, confused, or not enough. It's not respectful to walk away silently from someone you once claimed to care about. That's not peace. That's unfinished, that's emotional cowardice, and what makes it even more painful is that the person left behind often internalizes that silence as a reflection of their worth. They assume if someone couldn't even bother to speak, then maybe they weren't worth the effort. But let's be clear about something. The silence doesn't reflect your value. It reflects their inability to process their own discomfort. They couldn't face your reaction. They couldn't answer your questions. They didn't know how to own their choices, so they used silence as a shield. There's this false image people try to portray when they go silent, as if they're stoic, composed above the drama, but most of the time they're just frozen. Frozen by guilt, frozen by indecision, frozen by the fear of saying the wrong thing, so instead they say nothing and call it maturity, but silence can hurt more than honesty ever could. Words give you clarity, even if they're painful. Words give you something to process, something to understand, something to eventually forgive. Silence gives you nothing. It's empty. It keeps you stuck in a loop, wondering what went wrong, what you did, what they felt, why they left, if it was ever real. Silence forces you to finish a story without a final chapter, and that can haunt people for years. The irony is, the person who went silent often thinks they've spared themselves from discomfort, but what they've really done is plant a seed of regret. Because the feelings don't just disappear, they don't vanish just because they weren't voiced. Those feelings get buried, pushed down, packed away, but they're still there, and they come back in the middle of the night. In quiet moments, in memories that randomly hit while driving, in all the little reminders of what they didn't have the courage to say. That's not strength, that's avoidance, and avoidance always has a cost. So many people think if they just wait long enough, the silence will take care of everything, but time doesn't heal wounds that were never acknowledged. Time just covers them up until they resurface stronger. The longer someone avoids having the hard conversation, the heavier that silence becomes. It starts to eat away at them, not because they lost the relationship, but because they lost the chance to be honest. To show up, to do it right, that becomes the regret. We admire people who show grace, who stay calm, who don't beg or chase. But what we should really admire is the people who speak up when it's hard. The ones who choose courage over comfort, the ones who say, "This is where I am, and I know it might hurt to hear it, but you deserve the truth." That's real strength. Silence isn't noble, it's just quieter pain. For everyone involved, when someone suddenly pulls away, goes silent, or disappears from your life without explanation, your mind scrambles to find the reason. You analyze every last conversation, every word you spoke, every way you showed up. And slowly, that silence starts to feel like it must be about you. Like maybe you weren't enough. Maybe you were too much, too intense, too emotional, too inconvenient. You start to believe the quiet is a mirror of your value. But the truth is, his silence doesn't speak to your worth. It speaks to his limits. It reflects how emotionally available he was, how capable he was of dealing with discomfort, with conflict, with accountability. It shows you how ready he was, or wasn't, to show up for something real. That kind of silence doesn't come from someone who's grounded, healthy, and emotionally whole. It comes from someone who feels overwhelmed by connection, who doesn't have the maturity to lean in when things get deep, who doesn't yet know how to sit with vulnerability without feeling threatened by it. It's easier to pull away than it is to communicate. It's easier to ghost someone than it is to say, "I'm not ready for what you're asking of me." It's easier to disappear than to admit, "I'm scared," or "I don't know how to handle this," or "I've never had to face myself this way before." Silence is a shortcut. But shortcuts almost always lead to damage because they leave people behind without giving them a way to heal. You didn't get silence because you weren't worthy of words. You got silence because he didn't have them. You got silence because that was all he knew how to offer. That doesn't mean he didn't care. Sometimes people care deeply, but care alone doesn't equal capability. Love without responsibility, without emotional presence, without clarity, it's not enough. It leaves you chasing shadows, trying to fill in the blanks he was too afraid to speak aloud. It's easy to assume if he valued you, he would have stayed, that if you had been more lovable, more patient, more whatever, he wouldn't have left you wondering what happened. But the most powerful shift is realizing that his ability to communicate, to explain, to face the truth, that was always about his internal world, not yours. He might have grown up in a place where emotions were suppressed, where talking things through wasn't modeled. He may have been taught that needing someone made him weak, or that expressing fear or sadness was something to hide. Maybe he never learned how to regulate his emotions, so when the relationship asked him to show up in a bigger way, he panicked. And in that panic he shut down, not because you overwhelmed him, but because he was already overwhelmed by himself. You weren't asking for too much, you were asking for basic emotional honesty, and that's something he couldn't give, not because you weren't enough, but because he wasn't ready. It hurts, it really does, because it would be easier if there was a simple explanation. If you could label yourself the problem, then maybe you could fix it, change something, and make it work. But there was nothing to fix in you. The silence wasn't caused by your value, it was caused by his limits. And if you've been internalizing that silence as a verdict on your worth, it's time to change the narrative. His inability to speak, to stay, to face the hard moments, that's not a judgment on you. That's a revelation of him. We all have emotional ceilings. Some people never realize how low theirs are until they meet someone who challenges them to grow. And when that happens, they have a choice, rise or retreat. He chose to retreat, not because you weren't amazing, but because rising required a kind of courage he hadn't built yet. The worst thing you can do is shrink yourself to make sense of someone else's silence. The most powerful thing you can do is understand it for what it is, not a reflection of your failure, but a moment that revealed what he was truly ready for and what he wasn't. His silence is not your shame to carry. It's not your wound to reopen again and again. It's simply an answer you didn't want but needed, an answer that, while painful, gives you freedom because now you know it was never about your worth, it was always about his limits. There's a strange moment that happens after you've been hurt, after the silence, the distance, the loss. You spend nights wondering why it ended, asking yourself what you could have done differently. You feel the ache of someone who walked away too easily. And somewhere deep down, you hold on to this quiet hope. Maybe one day they'll realize what they lost. Maybe one day they'll come back. But that day never seems to come when you're still waiting, because regret doesn't arrive while you're still sitting in the pain. Regret comes after you've moved on, when you're still emotionally available, still hoping, still hurting. They don't feel the impact of your absence yet. You're still there, even in your silence. You still think about them. You still flinch when their name shows up unexpectedly, and they can feel that. Even if they don't fully understand it, they know they haven't fully lost you yet, so they keep going. They convince themselves you're fine, that you'll come around, that if they ever really wanted to, they could fix it, and then something shifts. You start showing up for yourself instead of for them. You start posting with joy that isn't curated for them to see. You laugh without checking if they're watching. You stop waiting. You stop wondering. You let go, not with a dramatic announcement, but with quiet internal certainty, and that's when it hits them. Not because they suddenly discovered some new truth about you. Not because you changed, but because you're no longer theirs to return to. Regret doesn't always show up as a dramatic apology. Sometimes it shows up in silence, in late night scrolling through your photos, in mutual friends mentioning how good you're doing, in the realization that you're becoming someone even more magnetic, more grounded, more unavailable than you were when they had access to you, because that's how life works. We often don't feel the weight of what we had until we can no longer reach it, and people don't grieve the loss of someone who's still emotionally within reach. They grieve when the door has closed, and they realize they don't know how to open it anymore. And here's what stings for them. They thought you'd always be there. They thought they could take their time. They thought you'd keep showing up. They thought your heart was something they could put on a shelf and come back to when they were ready. But people don't wait forever. Even the kindest hearts get tired. Even the most patient souls eventually stop bleeding for people who won't stop wounding them. So when you finally stop giving them your emotional energy, when your life no longer revolves around their absence, something inside them starts to shift. And it's not just about missing you, it's about facing the truth. They had something real. They couldn't see it, and now they can't reach it. Regret sneaks in when they see you loving yourself the way they didn't. It grows when they realize you're glowing without them. It deepens when they understand they lost something they weren't ready for. But that doesn't mean it wasn't valuable. It's easy to look back and say, I should have tried harder, but regret, once it's here, doesn't undo the damage. It can't rewrite the story. It only plays it back with sharper clarity. So if you've been waiting for someone to regret letting you go, don't. Because the moment you stop needing them to feel it, that's when they actually do, not because you finally won, but because your healing creates distance they can't cross anymore, and in that distance is where their regret lives. It's not your job to carry their realization. It's not your burden to witness it. Sometimes the most poetic justice is that they realize it all alone, silently, long after you've moved on. That's the moment they finally get it. And that's the moment it's already too late. So if you're still holding on, waiting for their regret to arrive like some kind of closure, let it go. Because the truth is, your peace doesn't depend on their realization. Their regret isn't the prize, your growth is. You moving forward, you choosing yourself, you building a life that no longer waits for someone who didn't choose you the first time. That's the real victory. And by the time they feel it, by the time the silence turns into ache and the memories start to sting, you'll be too far gone for it to matter. Not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started caring about you. Like, share, and if this hit your heart, subscribe, because you deserve to hear more truths that remind you just how powerful you really are.